We now bring another female member of our board to the podium, your Vice President, Lynn Brown, who will introduce today's speaker, Dr. Thomas Wright.
Thanks and welcome everybody. We were lucky enough last night to, actually yesterday afternoon, to meet with Thomas Wright in Washington. Those of us on the book tour, on the bus trip, and we had a really wonderful meeting and a wonderful day. We have Thomas's book for sale today at the end of the session. It's called All Measures Short of War, and he'll be happy to spend some time signing that book for you. So, Thomas Wright serves as the director of the Center of the United States and Europe and is a fellow with the Project on International Order and Strategy at the Brookings Institution. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Lowry Institute for International Policy. He previously served as executive director of studies at Chicago Council of Global Affairs and a lecturer at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. As I said, his book will be available for sale at the end of this meeting, and we're going to welcome Thomas Wright.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Great. If you get it closer to the microphone, a little bit more.
Does that work? You hear me down the back? Yeah, good. So thank you very much to Lynn and to David for the kind introduction and for the invitation to be here. And congratulations as well to Emma on your scholarship award. The very best of luck in your endeavours at the Model UN later this summer. It's a real privilege to be here. It was great to meet so many people here yesterday. I think there was a group here yesterday in Washington, DC, and myself and a colleague got a chance to talk about some of the big events that were going on then. It was interesting. I remember that I think you had, before you came to Brookings, you had been for some briefings on Korea.
Korea
Economic Institute, and it's just remarkable how swiftly things move today. That we found out last night that the director of the CIA, Mike Pompeo, had actually been to Pyongyang to meet Kim Jong-un, and we didn't know that yesterday. And there may be questions on that afterwards, but it just, I think, it's a sign of how dramatically and quickly things are moving on that front, but on many other fronts as well. Living in Washington, it's easy to get sort of a whiplash every morning as you look at your phone. And the last thing you should do is you look at your phone if you want to go back to sleep, because you'll be shocked into reality. I'm involved in a project at Brookings. I direct the Center for US and Europe, but I also work on a project on international order. No one quite knows what that is. I get routine emails from my mother asking me to explain it because and so is asking, even though I've told her before. But basically, we look at how the world is organized. And since World War II, people have been predicting the end of the international order. Some people thought it would end with a bang, others with a whimper. I don't think anyone thought it might end with a tweet. That's life in 2018. What I wanted to do is to talk to you a bit about this book that came out last year, and I actually have just finished a new introduction for a paperback, so it's a really good timing. I think I can talk a little bit about what's changed as well. But the book tries to take a bit of a step back and to ask, how is the international order changing? How is the world around us evolving? And what does that mean for the United States and for the rest of the world? And my sort of central idea or argument is that for 20 years after the Cold War, while it seemed very dangerous and there was terrorist attacks and there was problems in the Balkans and there was a war in Kosovo and there was lots of drama, that actually that period was quite a happy period. It was a period in which the major powers in the world all generally got along with each other. Right? They had differences of opinion. Sometimes there was crises like over the Iraq War, but even during the Iraq War, Russia objected to that at the UN, and it made its opinion clear diplomatically, but it didn't side with Saddam Hussein, right? It didn't send Russian forces into Iraq to fight the United States, nor did it do so in Afghanistan. Those are things, of course, that it's basically doing today in Syria. And so the world that we're sort of in, I think, is very different than it was back then. And something sort of fundamentally has changed, that we're no longer just dealing with the problems of terrorism, and pandemic disease, and financial crises. We're also dealing with these old problems of sort of major power rivalry. And so the book is sort of about why that has occurred. And you know, when you look at it, major power rivalry is actually pretty normal in world politics. I mean, since the nation state was basically came into existence, you know, in the 1600s, most of the time has been defined by competition, rivalry. And so the period that we had after the Cold War was sort of an anomaly. There was another small anomaly in the 19th century, in the early part after the Napoleonic Wars, but those are sort of the exceptions. And I argue that that period after the Cold War was one in which it was an era of convergence, that basically we believed, with some reason, that China and Russia would, as they traded with everybody else and globalized and became members of the global economy, that they would become part of the liberal international order, that they would become, as the former president of the World Bank, Bob Zedek, put it, responsible stakeholders in the international order. And that we would sort of see them working with us on common challenges, like terrorism, like pandemic disease, like climate change, because what unites us is far more important than what divides us. And the old sort of challenges of territorial disputes and different geopolitical things, they were really seen as a thing of the past. And you can sort of see this, you know, in successive US national security strategies, but also just at a more basic level, if you just look at what people were training in. I mean, now that Russia is back as an issue, it turns out there's hardly any Russian speakers in the US government, right? And the intelligence community has largely divested itself of people who know much about Russia, or even China. There's a few more there, but a lot of people know how to build it well in Afghanistan, and the different types of tribes, you know, in northern Iraq and in Afghanistan, and how to tell sort of the differences, because that was the challenge, you know, of our era. And what we've seen, I think, is this era of convergence basically has come apart. Now, instead of convergence, we have divergence, and we have Russia and China going in a very different direction. And this year, I think, and this month is a particularly appropriate time to have this conversation, because we saw in the last few months, you know, Xi Jinping in China basically declare that he won't be bound by the two-term limit in China. So, you know, so now he is basically leader for life in China, which is a dramatic break since the era of Deng Xiaoping. It's a fundamental transition from a more shared model of governance to a one-man rule model of governance. And in Russia, of course, we saw the quote-unquote election in Russia, which Vladimir Putin surprisingly won, of course. But he is also basically leader for life, you know. And a lot of people, I think, I was surprised when I heard just that Putin is only, you know, 64, 65 years old, so he's going to be around for a while, as will Xi Jinping will be around for a while. So we have two leaders who I think have a very sort of assertive nationalistic view of their countries. And so I try to sort of explain why, you know, why we sort of had hopes about people like Dmitry Medvedev and others, or hopes about China, and those came apart. And basically what I say at the beginning of the book is that, you know, Russia and China, I think, went along with the United States, partly because the US was so far ahead, they thought it didn't really make sense to try to push back. Partly because they saw this liberal international order as sort of a mixed bag, there were positive things about it. And partly because there was common challenges that were important. But over time, particularly as they decided internally that they would continue to be authoritarian, I think they saw that outside world as a threat. And now people often say that's NATO, you know, in Europe that's NATO's expansion. But I think it's a little more complicated than that. If you look at the Chinese case, one of the things that the Chinese government was most worried about was actually the US media doing its job. So in 2012, the New York Times was in Beijing and basically had access to publicly available records, and they discovered something really interesting, which was the members of the Politburo had very little money themselves individually, but their wives and children were all multi-millionaires. And they published this, and it created a huge scandal in China, and it really undermined the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party because it sort of exposed this endemic corruption. Well, they saw, that was just one example where they saw this open liberal society. You know, no decision was made in Washington to do that. That wasn't, you know, an action of the US government. That was just the free press doing its job. But it sort of underscored the risks of the Chinese regime. And in Russia, they worried, of course, about what Washington or London or other capitals might do, but they also worried about NGOs, and they worried about the internet, and they worried about student exchanges, and they worried about anything that could foment revolution in Russia. And so if you combine that with a whole lot of other things that are sort of more geopolitical, when Putin came back to power in 2011, I think he made a decision that he couldn't really you know, find some compromise with the West, and that he would have to sort of confront it, and that that would be good for his domestic legitimacy. Because if he reformed and he opened up to improve the economy, then people would demand more of a say, and it would spell the end, arguably, of his regime. And so I think since about the time of the financial crisis, but particularly after 2012, when Putin is back and Xi Jinping is in power, we see this real divergence in the world. And we also see it in other areas. You know, we see it in the financial crisis. The expectation was that the global economy would work for everybody, and that it was sort of a one-way bet, right? If you participated in the global economy, you would become prosperous. If anyone goes back and reads Tom Friedman's books from the time, they're all about, you know, the golden straitjacket and the one-way ticket to success, and the Lexus and the olive tree book and all of that sort of spells out the case for it. But in 2008-09, we found out it wasn't a one-way bet, and there was a risk of crisis and a deep recession. And that has caused people to question whether they want to converge on a single model of a global economy. You know, they don't necessarily want to be open and integrated. They want to have some protection there. And so that was another area where we saw, separate to Russia and China, where we saw within the Western world, within the United States, this separation out from convergence. And we also saw it in the Middle East. You know, for many years, American leaders of both parties believed that the Middle East would become democratic. They thought there would be different mechanisms for getting there. President Bush thought you could impose it from the outside. President Obama believed you could work with indigenous communities to encourage it from the inside. But both of those hopes were dashed really with the failure of the Arab Awakening. And so in the Arab Awakening, the big hope of everybody failed, and the revolutions were put down, or they didn't work out, and they were overturned in the case of Egypt in particular. Now there is basically nobody really believes that the Middle East is trending in the right direction. Right? They believe that we can work with the Saudis, or we can work with Mohammed bin Salman, or work with others, maybe work with Sisi, but no one believes that he's going to liberalize politically. Right? No one believes they're going to become more democratic. And we believe we're sort of looking at a new era of authoritarian rule. So throughout the world, I think there was this hope and expectation in the 2000s, despite the fact that it was, you know, a tough time in terms of the wars and terrorism, the Iraq War, that the broader world seemed to be going in the right direction. And that, I think, has changed. And that's really what the book is about. It's about what comes next. So I try to explain why we got to where we are, but also what does the future look like. And I think the future, you know, I'm both pessimistic and optimistic. And so I'm pessimistic in that I think there are big challenges ahead, but I'm optimistic in the sense that I do believe the United States and its allies are well capable of meeting those challenges. That the challenges aren't greater necessarily than the challenges of the past. But I think that the fundamental sort of organizing principle of the world is no longer terrorism and weak states and transnational problems, and they will continue to be important. But we now need to worry more about the concentration of power, about big states, about the things that Russia, China, Iran, and others, Turkey, other major countries may do. And history will really be set by the leaders of those countries and by the peoples of those countries and the decisions that they make, and of course including our own government here. So I think we're seeing a return of geopolitical competition, but it's with a twist, right? And the twist is that we are living in a world that's ever more interdependent, interconnected than ever before, right? We are completely linked. You can obviously send an email to the other side of the world in no seconds at all. Financial systems are totally integrated. Supply chains are totally integrated. Culture is heavily shared throughout the world. There are many different complicated systems that are all interdependent. And so we find ourselves sort of waking up after 20 years of unprecedented integration, and all of a sudden finding that we're sort of rivals. Not the allies, but the allies maybe vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Iran. And as we see there, that makes the competition quite complicated and quite sort of difficult, and I'll get back to that in a second. But I'd like to just take a moment to say what I think this competition is about, right? Why does it matter to people? And I think the reason is that what it's about is that basically we're seeing two different types of world international order on offer, right? There's the traditional US vision, which is a sort of international order that has an open global economy, right? Where countries can trade with each other, where the US Navy sort of protects critical sea lanes, and they're kept open for everyone to sort of use and to trade, where basically there aren't that many tariffs in the world. It's not fully tariff-free, but there's a lot less tariffs. There's fairly free movement of capital, so countries can invest, companies can invest around the world, and we see sort of shared cooperation economically. So that's one piece of it. A second piece of it is that we see alliances that are really about trying to promote geopolitical stability. So the US has an alliance with Japan and with NATO, and those alliances involve sort of US troops overseas, but interestingly enough, they don't really involve conflicts, right? Because the conflicts are with third parties in the Middle East or elsewhere, but there hasn't been a war, a major war in Europe, obviously for 70 years, and there hasn't been a minor war since the Balkans. And in East Asia has been largely at peace. Northeast Asia has been at peace since 1953, and Southeast Asia since Vietnam. So we see that these regions are fairly stable, so the US and its allies really believe in those alliances as a part of the international order. And then the final piece is that while it's often imperfect and inconsistent, there is sort of a push for democracy, for human rights, and for sort of classically liberal values. When I say liberal, I don't mean it in the American political sense, but more in the classic philosophical sense, that everybody believes that people ought to be free, that there ought to be a rule of law, that governments ought to be accountable in some way. So those are sort of the key elements of that order. And that sort of order aspires to be universal, right? We believe basically that over time, all countries could join that because all people basically want to be free, all people want to be democratic. Maybe not immediately, maybe it's not an even line, but if you look at where the world was in 1947-48 and look at where it is today, the number of democracies has exploded. I mean, it's a far greater number. And many countries that started out as autocratic, like South Korea, are now in the top 10 of the world's global economies, and they're democratic and they're strong allies. So it's a really remarkable transformation. So that's sort of the first type of model. And the second, which I think we're learning more about, is sort of the Russia-China sort of authoritarian model. Now, Russia and China are very different, right? Russia's a declining power. It's largely a land power. It doesn't have many assets other than its military, right? It doesn't have a modern economy, and it is very hostile, I think, to the international order. China is a rising power. It's largely maritime. It has, although it has obviously a large land border as well, but most of its geopolitical ambitions are concentrated in the maritime space. And it has a lot of power other than hard military power. It doesn't have to rely just on its military. It's economic power, cultural, soft power, and other types of power. So you see these countries are very different, but I think they do have one thing in common, which is they both want a type of international order that rejects the notion of alliances as the founding sort of principle of it. They want to be a larger dominant power in their own region. China wants to displace the US in East Asia and be the preeminent power there, and Russia would like to replace the US in Eastern Europe, or at least weaken the US position there. So they have a spheres of influence idea, which is a very historical sort of model, very different than the one we have. It tends to be more mercantilist and nationalistic in orientation, and also they want a world safe for authoritarianism, because they basically, more than anything, care about their own regime. So they worry about an open internet, they worry about open communications and freedom of the press, and NGOs and the like. If you try to get a visa to China today and you come from an NGO, and Brookings of Canada is an NGO, it's actually quite difficult to get a visa, and there's a lot of restrictions on universities and others that weren't in place before. In Russia, it's much worse. So they're sort of pushing back and monitoring, obviously, internet usage and other things to a very great extent internally, because they want to ensure domestic stability, like the continuation of their regimes. So I think we're seeing a choice between these sort of two worlds. One type of order that's sort of recognizable to what we've had before, and the other that I think is more nationalistic, more closed, more in blocks and not universal, and less sort of free, less democratic, less focused on human rights. We see the erosion of democracy in certain places. We're already seeing that in parts of Central and Eastern Europe, particularly in Hungary and some other countries as well. And so I think that's sort of what the competition is about now. That's what we're sort of looking at. And I think there's several different features really that come into play. The first is, and this is really where the title of the book comes from, I don't think the major powers want to fight each other really. I don't think that Russia intends to go to war with the United States, and I don't think China does, and I don't think the United States wants to go to war with them. I don't think that Putin really believes that would be in his interest, and I think when we see rhetoric around that, it's usually rhetoric. Well, there's always the risk of inadvertent conflict, and we need to be very careful about that, and there's always the risk of accidents and miscalculation. But in terms of what people are preparing for, there's no like Kaiser Wilhelm II, right? There's no one who sort of thinks there's going to be a major conflict and he can win it. But they do believe that they can compete with, and this is the title of the book, all measures short of major war, all measures short of war. So we see cyber war and proxy wars in Syria, and economic warfare, the US using sanctions, and ideological competition, and coercive diplomacy like we're seeing in the South China Sea. So all different, lots and lots of different types of tactics and tools that we haven't really contemplated before. And so we see a normal period of peacetime, but one that's much more tense and much more competitive than the peace between the major powers that we saw in the 90s and 2000s. And so I think we're seeing an increase in competition there in a way that we haven't had so to this point. The second thing that I think is sort of very interesting about it is that I remember I was saying earlier that we're very integrated with each other. Well, we're integrated. We used to believe that integration made us sort of friends and partners, right? That if you are interdependent with another country or another party, then you could be, you're more likely to be closer to them. But what we're discovering is that interdependence also creates vulnerability, right? If you're closer to someone they know how to hurt you in a way that if they have nothing to do with you, they may not know how to do that. And so today, we see that Russia is worried about being integrated with the US in economics because it worries about US sanctions, and the US with Europe largely dominates the financial system, and we can sort of turn off the plug if Russia does something like invade Ukraine that we really don't like. There can be an economic response. So they feel like that's weaponizing integration. We believe that Russia and China have weaponized integration with cyber. Right? We're all integrated in sort of information systems, and they're weaponizing that and using it in ways, particularly in Russia's case, at the last election. So I think we're seeing this weaponization of integration, and people worry that integration is now a strategic risk. Like they worry about having too much to do with the rival because of what that could mean, and what China might do with its large sort of economic reserve, its large financial reserves of US treasuries and the like, that people have been concerned about that for a while. And there's a variety of other things. Now some of this I think is overblown, but some of it is actually real. And I think we're likely to see, as time goes on, particularly in the area of technology, we're likely to see us sort of being surprised by our vulnerabilities, right, by our openness. And we're going to have to try to figure out a way to protect ourselves against being too open while not becoming closed. And that's a really hard line to walk. I mean, think about all of the warnings we get now, and everyone gets in their email accounts, about hackers and phishing expeditions and the like, and that you need to wonder, what do I need to do today? And well, we'll probably have communications that are more restricted and more protected, but less easy to use because we're sort of worried about those connections. And then the final thing is that I think we'll see countries sort of hedging against that, and we're likely to see countries pulling back a bit because they're worried about globalization, and they hedge against globalization, and they hedge against that integration risk. So I think as we look at this sort of new world, and as we sort of try to understand it, we see that we are sort of much more competitive, and that there is that risk from integration. And there's a final sort of risk as well, which I'll mention, which is, I think it's on technology. That if you look back at the Cold War is inseparable from nuclear weapons. Right? The minute we think of the Cold War, we think of nuclear weapons. Right? We think of duck and cover, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the culture of the time was really living on the brink of Armageddon. It was especially in the 50s and 60s, and then it eased a little bit and came back in the early 80s. But it was inextricably linked to the technology of the time. This new era will be linked to the technologies of our time. Right? We don't quite know what they are, what those new innovations will be, but we already see signs of it, particularly on artificial intelligence, where we expect the most significant breakthroughs. The new arms race of the 21st century is really in artificial intelligence and in quantum technology, with the US and China leading the charge with huge, enormous projects investing in this to try to get some sense of what a breakthrough might be. In quantum technology, for instance, a possible breakthrough is that one side may be able to have fully encrypted communications, and the other side would have fully open communications. So the first, if one country broke through in that and the other didn't, imagine a world in which the US could or could not encrypt everything, and the other side could or could not do it. So China could encrypt everything, but we could encrypt nothing. That's a possible technological breakthrough that would be a game changer. Or in artificial intelligence, people talk about the risk that aircraft carriers could be vulnerable to large swarms of autonomous drones, that may make them vulnerable in a way that they haven't been in the past. So it's hard to know where the line is between science fiction and reality, but the technology experts say that we're not too far away from that type of world. So we see all sorts of investment in those technologies because no country wants to lose, right? Because rivalry is a great motivator. And so, so we see the Pentagon investing in this because they're worried that China will get there first, and vice versa. Well, that will largely shape, I think, this future, and then that future will shape society, right? The breakthroughs that are made, some will be used for good, some will be used for bad, but already we've seen with the Russian use of these bots on Twitter and all of these fake accounts and the like, and automated accounts, we've already seen that sort of challenge what we think about the media, challenge what we think about elections. And I think we're only at the beginning of that period, actually, so we're likely to see more and more attempts to protect against it, of course, as well. I should say a word before I talk about US options, and then I'd love to hear your questions and comments. It's just on the Middle East, which I think is really, is quite sort of, different in a way than Russia and China. I wouldn't put Iran in the same category, because I think they're not as strong. But we see a regional Cold War in the Middle East as well. We see this geopolitical rivalry infused with sectarianism. So that Sunni-Shia divide, layered on top of these geopolitical rivalries between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And we see a region that really has no status quo because it was all blown up in the Arab awakening. And we see this intense rivalry between the Shia states, between Iran on the one hand, with its proxy forces in Hezbollah, and then the Sunni Arab states on the other hand, led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And that conflict, I think, is gathering pace, and it's largely actually fought not over territory, it's fought over the domestic governance of individual countries. It's fought over which faction gets to sort of govern Iraq or Bahrain or Syria. And so that makes it actually even more intense than a normal sort of territorial dispute. And the choice is really between the US getting involved there, which comes at a big risk of getting embroiled in a conflict we don't fully understand with no exit. That's one risk. But the other risk is of contagion. If you don't do anything, the fire rages out of control and gets much worse, as has been the case in Syria with over 500,000 people dead in the Syrian civil war. And it's an impossible choice. It's really about choosing your poison, right? There's no good answer, unfortunately. I think the Middle East, in this case, is not, as we look at it through a competitive model, it's not a prize to be won, right? It's not sort of that everyone's trying to figure out how to dominate the Middle East. It's really a question about how to manage the problems there, how to sort of ensure that they don't get out of control, how to ensure that they don't spread and destabilize the region and then the wider world. And that's sort of the challenge we have there. So I think it is sort of a unique case. I'd just like to finish on the US and what we've seen over the last few years. I've been writing about the President Trump's foreign policy for about a year before he became president, because one weekend I was at home with nothing to do, and I decided to look at the things he had said about foreign policy dating back to the 1980s, and I found out he actually said a lot, and it was very consistent. He sort of said the same things since 1987 on alliances, on trade and other things. And so he came into office, I think, with a set of beliefs that were very different than normal, that presidents have normally have had, right? He really disagreed with the idea of alliances. He disagreed with an open global economy, and he thought that the US shouldn't be promoting human rights and democracy, right? Those are three things he was very consistent on. But in government, he has not fully implemented that, because many of his team actually do believe in those things. So we've sort of seen two different approaches. We've seen his team's approach that's more traditional, and then we've seen his personal opinion, which he'll often express, which is more in accordance with those beliefs. And he doesn't always get his way, and his team don't always get their way, and then we see this sort of contradictory approach. But it's interesting in the national security strategy that they actually embrace this idea that the world has shifted from one where we deal mainly with the terrorism threat to one where we're dealing mainly with great powers. And so that's now the official Trump administration policy. It's not necessarily Trump's personal view, though. So it's an interesting nuance. He has sort of expressed a different view in his own speeches. But I think as we look forward to the next elections, really whether it's the Trump administration or a different administration, there is a fundamental choice that America has to make about what it wants to do in the world. Does the United States want to continue its traditional role of leading most of the world in pursuit of a vision of international order that transcends narrow national interest? That is one where you believe that America first means having a healthy international system, that's the best way to protect US interests? Or will the United States choose to sort of pull back to say that that era is over, that actually the US has very few interests overseas and that the rest of the world should fend for itself? And I think that's probably the most consequential foreign policy decision that the US will have taken since the 1940s, since after World War II. And in the book I tried to explain, I have my own view, which is I strongly believe the US should continue to provide leadership and should try to revitalize and renovate, reform, but maintain and sustain this international order. But I think there are trade-offs on both sides. So in the book I try to treat both arguments as fairly as I can, and to say that it is really about balancing risk. It's really about which of these sort of costs and benefits, each has its set of costs and benefits, so which do you want to choose? And I think that choice will be inescapable, I think, the closer, as the years go by. But the indications are, at the moment, I think that the US, there seems to be a broad view in both parties, with some dissenters, that the US should try to continue to lead, but whether or not that's possible, I think it's really the open question. But I believe basically that it's a choice, it's not preordained. So if the US wants to do this, I think it's possible, because I don't believe the United States is in decline. I think actually the US is doing quite well and is very competitive. And a lot of other countries believe in the same things that the US believes in the world, and that's why they want to help, right? Because they too have an interest in it, in trade, in an open economy, and maybe a fairer trade than we have at the moment, maybe some changes there, but they don't believe it should be completely closed off. They also believe in human rights and democracy, and they also believe in the alliances. So I am, as I go back to what I said earlier, optimistic, even though I am a little pessimistic about where the world is headed. I'm optimistic about our ability to deal with it. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.